Welcome, everyone. On both platforms, it's a pleasure to see you here today. This is the second session of Mishnah in Depth Nedarim with Rabbi David Silber. This class is a project of Drisha's Rivka Rosenwein Mission Division and is sponsored by her family in her memory. This course is designed to accompany daily independent study of the Mishnah following the Mishnah Yomit schedule. We will meet weekly as a community of learners to augment our independent study, enhance our understanding of the mishnayot learned, and support each other as a community of learners in the daily study of this foundational text. Rabbi David Silber is the Dean of Drisha and our founder, and he is an author on several books, including lately Malchut Adan, Yun B'Sefer Shmuel, a lecture on the Bible, and we're glad to have him back. He taught on the Mishnah in Depth Nazir. Then we had Rabbi Sarna for Ketubot, and we're glad to have him back for Nedarim. I am going to be sending invitations to panelists if you're just stepping in on Zoom. That will make it so you can ask questions directly, and to Rabbi Silber to unmute yourself, to turn on your camera. If you don't want to, that's fine. Whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook, please feel welcome to ask questions. You can ask them in the chat, and I'll bring them to Rabbi Silber's attention. You can speak out and ask them. We want to hear you speak. Sources for today are from Mishnah Nedarim. I will be sharing them on screen in Sefaria, but please feel welcome to follow along with your own preferred copy. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kayla. All right, so before we start with the new mishnayot, I just wanted to return to what I mentioned last week by way of introduction. The very first Mishnah in the Nedarim, first few words are kinuye nedarim kinedarim. In other words, a kinui is a kind of, one might say, kind of slang. In other words, a normal neder in this tractate is normal, is what I say. For example, this book is forbidden to me. Now, the book there's nothing wrong with the book, but this piece of chocolate is forbidden to me. Kosher, a person is permitted, has the right and the ability to forbid something which is permissible to oneself. And when you forbid the object to yourself, that's what the Mishnah calls a neder. On the other hand, if I say, I swear not to eat this piece of chocolate, that works. That's not a neder. That's a shvuah. So I'm forbidding myself to eat the chocolate. And there are differences, several, between a neder and a shvuah. We're not going to get back into that now, and we'll probably come across it again as we look at the tractate. Here, there's a very important point. So I mentioned last week that the word neder is used in two very different ways. Normally, when you look at the Torah and it talks about a neder, what it means is a person is determining to bring a sacrifice or to donate something to the temple. That's called hegdish or nidre hegdish. I can say this cow is going to be a korban. This cow will be a sacrifice. It'll be a burnt offering. It'll be a shlamim, a good offering, etc. That's one kind of neder. Or I can donate to the temple funds. That's called nidre hegdish. And there's the other kind of neder called nidre iser. As I said, this book is forbidden to me. Now in the Mishnah, so there's two kinds of nedarim. This tractate deals mostly with the second type. You forbid something that should be permissible. You forbid that object that has to be an object. It can't be a theoretical. It can't be I forbid sleep on myself. Sleep's not an object. I forbid food. This food that works. Now, the Mishnah says you would normally say something is forbidden to me. Ochel zev asur alai would be a neder. Now, the Mishnah, this is a very important point. So the Mishnah says, if you were, normally you would say something like, this object, you can say something like, this object, instead of saying forbidden to me, this object is a carbon, is a sacrifice to me. It doesn't mean you bring it as a sacrifice, but it means it's forbidden. And the word carbon in the Mishnah, in the second Mishnah of the tractate, chapter 1, Mishnah 2, the Mishnah gives examples of words that are slang for carbon. For example, Mishnah 2, Omer Chavero, Konam, Koda, Kones, Hareo Kinuyim carbon. That works, actually. Slang works, and that's called the kinui. What is defined as slang? What's beyond the pale? That's the Mishnah deals with that, but we're not going to get into that detail. But the main point is that if you say something is a carbon to me, this food, this dessert, carbon alai, that's a neder, and it's forbidden to me. And if I eat the carbon, I violate my neder. The Torah says, "Lo yachel dvaro." Your words should not be rendered chol, profane. If I ate it, I would violate lo yachel dvaro. Okay. Now there's a very important commentary called Rabbi Nisim. Let me just say a couple of words about tractate Nedarim and why it's seen as a very unique tractate. This is not so relevant to the Mishnah, but it's relevant to the Gemara. When you open up a Gemara, and the Mishnah is really a gateway to rabbinic teachings, to Gemara, etc. You open up a normal Shas, a normal Gemara, standard Gemara, classical Gemara. So you open it up, starts on page number 2, and in the middle of the page is usually in block print. That's the Gemara. He starts with a Mishnah, have a Gemara. To the right of it, though, to the right side, there's a commentary. Usually that's Rashi. Rashi is the main commentary on the Gemara that people have read for hundreds and hundreds of years. On the left side of the standard page are what's called the Balei HaTosfot. They're also Ashkenazic or French medieval scholars, and they usually comment on the Gemara. Sometimes they take issue with Rashi, they quote Rashi, etc. That is the standard. Now, all kinds of new editions have other things, but those are the absolute standard. Every Gemara you open up, every normal Gemara you open up, Rashi on one side and Tosfot on the other. The tractate Nedarim is different, because tractate Nedarim, there is no Rashi. There's a commentary, it's not Rashi, actually. Rashi is found on most tractates, but the main commentary on tractate Nedarim is Rabbi Nisim, known as the Ran, who's amazing, actually. The Ran is amazing, and very unlike Rashi. Rashi is the great teacher. Rashi is very terse. The Ran goes on much more. He deals with issues in a very broad sense, which is why when you open up a tractate Nedarim, it has a lot of pages. The amount of Gemara on each page is relatively smaller, because the Ran takes up a lot of space. And the core issues, people love the Ran. There's a reason for it. And the fact is that the Ran raises all kinds of basic questions as you go through the tractate. And here's a question that the Ran raises, which is a very interesting question, very central question. The Ran raises the following question. If someone says, this object is forbidden to me, let's say beneder, kikar zeh osor alai beneder, this piece of bread is forbidden to me with a neder, then it's forbidden. If I say kikar zeh osor alai carbon, it's forbidden. It's like a carbon, it's forbidden for me to eat. It's a normal, nice piece of kosher bread, normal, but you can forbid it on yourself. The Ran raises a basic question, which is a very interesting question. This question is this: isn't that fundamentally there are two different ways to forbid an object on yourself? One is to simply say, this object is forbidden to me. I declare this object forbidden to me. That's an neder. And another way, instead of saying I declare the object forbidden to me, is to say this object is like a sacrifice, is like a carbon. Two different paths, two different ways to make something forbidden to me, and that is a neder. The object is forbidden if I violate my neder. It's a Torah prohibition. Lo yachel dvaro, do not profane your word. Is that what it is? Or, says the Ran, maybe it's something different. Maybe fundamentally there's only one way to forbid an object on myself. And that is to say, this object is to me like a sacrifice, like a carbon. All Nedarim, all Nidrei Isser, flow from Nidrei Hegdish. The only thing is, if I didn't say the word carbon, it could still work for a different reason. Because in the first Mishnah in this tractate Nedarim, you don't always have to spell it out. Sometimes if you use a partial language, or the context makes it clear what you're saying, that if by saying this object is forbidden to me by neder, what I'm really saying is this object is forbidden to me like a carbon. That's the Ran's question. And then Ran talks about this at length. He actually contradicts himself. Because in one lengthy discourse, he says the second way. It's really everything's a carbon. And the other place, he says, they're two different paths. You could say it's like a carbon, and then it becomes forbidden, or you could just say it's a neder, it's forbidden to me. But the reason I mention this over here, apart from the fact this is a very basic question, is because I wanted to put on the table and make it clear that if you say the second way, fundamentally, what that means is there's really one kind of neder, which is I make a neder to bring a sacrifice, a carbon. That's fundamentally what a neder is. The only thing is, the rabbinic understanding is that given the concept of hegdish, that you can actually attach other things to the concept of hegdish, what they call hadpasa. You're sort of connecting, it's tofes, it's connected. But fundamentally, theoretically, everything in a certain sense is nidrei hegdish. That's what the Ran, that's the question the Ran raises. And when one studies tractate Nedarim, that's one of the main questions when you study the Gemara. Ran raised that question, and he goes on a great length trying to bring proofs this way and that way. But conceptually, it's actually a very interesting idea, because if you assume that fundamentally a neder is a sacrifice, the only thing is you can expand it. You can expand the idea of sacrifice to other realms. And this brings me to two mishnayot that I want to look at right now. Let's find these two mishnayot. Let's see. One mishnah is in chapter 1. I think it's Mishnah 4. Let me just double check that. Yes, chapter 1, Mishnah 4. Chapter 1, Mishnah 4, and then we'll look very quickly at chapter 2, Mishnah 1. Okay? Just quickly. I mean, there's so many mishnayot in the Nedarim, and it's actually what I like about this tractate, and this is a world, basically. It's called the world of Hafla'ah. It's this different world. You know, all kinds of and the idea, by the way, the idea to think about this, not now, but to think about it, to reflect on the idea that a person can actually make things forbidden at the same status as the Torah. And you could actually do that. That's something to think about. That's like the concept that you could actually make something forbidden. You can create a new prohibition. This piece of bread, you could actually make it forbidden to you. That's an interesting idea.
Rabbi Silber, just a question before we dive in.
Yes.
From Miriam Smirnoff, why don't we have Rashi on Nedarim? Are there any other Masechtot that don't have any Rashi?
Yes, there are several Masechtot that don't have Rashi. Sometimes we know they don't have Rashi, and sometimes Rashi is printed on the side of the page, but it's not actually Rashi. So there are several such Masechtot. There are two Masechtot where Rashi's commentary stops in the middle. Most famous is Bava Batra, which is the third in the Nezikin, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, which is the longest tractate, 176 pages times 2, so it's 350, whatever, 52. And I think on page 29, some of the Shas says, Kan mate Rashi. Rashi died here. Now, he didn't actually die there. And the reason we don't have Rashi on some Masechtot, there are different reasons. There is I'm just reading a book about Rashi, and actually, one belief is that Rashi fundamentally wrote on every tractate, but we simply lost some of the manuscripts. We don't have them. I think that's probably the prevailing theory, but I don't know why specifically on the Nedarim we don't have Rashi. There's something printed, but it's not Rashi. Same with Moed Katan, which deals with laws of Kol HaMoed and laws of Avelut. Rashi's printed, but it is not Rashi. And I think that probably what happened was, since Rashi was the most popular and the most prolific commentary, when people found something that looked like Rashi and they didn't have Rashi, they put it there and people called it Rashi. And there were others. I can't get into it now, but there were other so-called commentaries of Rashi that we know are not Rashi. Rabbeinu Alfasi, the great Rabbeinu Alfasi, Rif, whose code and commentary is printed in the back of many volumes of the Shas. There's a Rashi on the Rif, which is not Rashi for the most part. But in any event, so yes, there are some tractates that we don't. Maybe 7, 8, 9 tractates that we don't have Rashi. Some we simply don't have it, and some we presume it to be lost. But when you learn the Nedarim, I mean, there are other things printed on the page of the Nedarim, since Rashi is not really there, that actually are not printed on most other tractates. But when you learn the Nedarim, it's the Rod. I mean, it's the Rod of the Nedarim is. It's unusual to have some commentary like that. That this is the Rod of the Nedarim is like well known. Now, with the two mishnayot over here, it's a very good question, and there's a lot of stuff. There's an enormous amount of work. I think probably there's more stuff written about Rashi than any other commentary. Rashi was the first Jewish text ever actually printing press, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of commentaries on Rashi. So Rashi is quite incredible, really. And we could easily make the argument that I think in terms of the study of Torah, probably Rashi is the most significant person. People study Chumash and Rashi, you know what I mean? It's a given. So even though there was a sort of opposition to Rashi in many quarters, it's a whole other long story, which is extremely interesting. But yes, some tracts they do not have Rashi. And let me get to these two mishnayot over here. And I'll stop and take more questions too. I just want to point out I mentioned this last week in passing by way of introduction. I want to point out two mishnayot. One is the chapter 1, Mishnah 4, and chapter 2, Mishnah 1. This is an important point. The Mishnah says, Homer, Karban, Ola, Mincha, Chatat, Toda, Shlamim, She'eni Ochel Lach, Asur. If someone says that, say someone's talking to his friend, another person, and says to that person, your food is to me like a carbon, a sacrifice, or an ola, which is a specific kind of sacrifice, a burnt offering, or a mincha, which is a grain offering, or a chatat, a sin offering, or a toda, a thanksgiving offering, or a shlamim, a goodwill offering. She'eni ochel lach asur. Fine. So this is fine. So according to the first view of the Mishnah, this is forbidden. And this is standard. In other words, the standard, what's called the carbon, or in the language of the Mishnah, the word kodam often appears. Kodam is slang for carbon. This is forbidden. If I say that, I'll discuss this a little bit in a minute, but if I say, not only to someone else, my own friend, I said, this book is to me a carbon, this book is to me a mincha, then the book is forbidden. I can't benefit from the book. I can't read the book. This is the beginning of the Mishnah. It's Mishnah chapter 1, Mishnah 4. Fine. Now, when you look just quickly at the next Mishnah, chapter 2, Mishnah 1, it says V'elu mutarim. These. If I made this kind of a statement, the object is mutar, permissible. It doesn't take effect. Chulin she'ochalach if I say that what your stuff is to me like chulin, it's not kodesh, but chulin, or I say kibsar chazir, kavod zara, ki orot levuvin, kinevelot, kitrefot, kishkotzim, kiramosim, kichalad aron utrumato muter. So the Mishnah gives a bunch of cases where if I say that this food is to me like b'sar chazir, pig meat. Pig meat is forbidden. Avodah zara, something idolatrous, which is forbidden to benefit from. Orot levuvin. These are again, it's a kind of avodah zara. The orot levuvin is some kind of the skin of an animal that has certain tears in it, which is part of an avodah zara practice. So the avodah zara is forbidden. Nevelo, a nevelo is an animal that died without shchita. Trefot, an animal that has certain diseases, which render it forbidden to eat. Shkotzim, crawling things. Ramasim, forbidden things that creep and crawl. All of these things. Kechalat aron utrumato. If I say this food is like challah, when you have dough, a certain amount of dough, you have to take part of the dough off and give it to Aaron. Or truma. There's a rule that when crops are growing, you have to take the first piece of it and declare it to be truma. Challah and truma have similar status. They're forbidden for a non-Kohen to eat them. Muter. But if I say my book is like truma, my book is like challah, my book is like a neveh or a trefa or a zara, that is permissible. Now, why is that permissible? What's the difference between this Mishnah and the previous Mishnah? In each case, I'm saying this object called A is like a carbon. Here I'm saying this A is like a trefa, the veil, which is forbidden. This is a very core idea in the Mishnah. And the core idea is that you can only make something forbidden if you connect it to what the Mishnah calls, and Gemara calls, a davar hanadur. That is to say, something which in and of itself can only become forbidden if I take a vow. For example, a carbon. When I say that, but this animal should be a carbon shlamim or a carbon ola or a chatat, whatever. So my statement, this animal is a carbon, that's called davar hanadur. I took a neder. The neder forbids it. So if I then say this animal is a carbon, and this book over here should be like a carbon, that's forbidden. That's called a marpis. I'm connecting it to a davar hanadur. But this Mishnah in chapter 2, Mishnah number 1, that's a different business. These things have nothing to do with me. The fact that I can't eat chazir, pig meat, has nothing to do with me. I don't have to say I'm not eating it. It is forbidden in and of the Torah forbids it. So if it's something that the Torah forbids, and they want to extend the prohibited nature of the Torah, that which is forbidden from the Torah, to something that I want to become forbidden, that doesn't work. It only works on davar hanadur. It does not work on davar ha'asur. That's the principle that emerges from these two mishnayot, which is central to the tractate. There is, however, before I'll stop and take questions in a minute, but there is actually in the Mishnah, in chapter 2, Mishnah 1, that I just read a few lines of, there is actually a problem over here. In other words, something to think about in this Mishnah, which is sort of counterintuitive. And that is amongst the things that the Mishnah lists, an animal that died without shchita, or an animal that had disease, that's called a trefa, creeping and crawling things that are forbidden to eat, certain insects, certain rodents that are forbidden to eat. We understand that's nothing to do with me. The Torah forbids. But what is curious are the last two on the list: chalat aron utrumato. Chala and truma. That is actually strange. Why? Because if someone takes truma, someone has a field, and you decide to take truma from the field, you have to take truma and give it to the Kohen. If you can't eat, if truma wasn't taken from food, you're not allowed to eat it. That's called teva. But when I declare something truma, okay, that seems to have the status of a vow, of a neder. And how do we know that's true? Because the halacha is, if you take challah from something, you declare something to be challah from the dough. That's the portion that's going to go to the Kohen. Or truma. You take truma. Nowadays it's problematic because nowadays everybody's tummy, and you can't eat these things but tumah. But let's say at a time where the Kohanim were not tummy. Nowadays we take challah and put it aside. We don't give it to the Kohen. But in any event, but let's say you took truma, took a certain amount of truma, and then truma you can give any amount. Let's say you gave a large amount and you realized, actually I gave a lot of truma. It's probably too much. I really don't have. I'm going to eat myself. You can go to a court, and you can be matir neder. You can annul your vow. In other words, truma and challah have the halacha, which appears late in the last 3 chapters of this tract of this masechta, called hatarat nedarim. You can be matir neder on truma and on challah, which raises the question: if that is the case, then why, if I say that this book should be like truma, or this book should be like challah, why doesn't that work? What's the difference between saying this book should be like a carbon shlamim, which is a neder, or this book should be like truma or challah? Yet the Mishnah distinguishes them. The Mishnah lists truma and challah in chapter 2, Mishnah 1, with treifa, nevela, avodah zarah, chazir. Why aren't truma and challah the same as a carbon? It's a neder, and you can, in fact, you can be shower, you can be matur your neder. So the commentaries raise this question. I didn't make the question up. And one form or another, we have to distinguish. I think one of the main distinctions is that fundamentally, it's true that you could then go afterwards to a court and you could know the making it truma. However, at the end of the day, truma and challah fundamentally, when you give them to the Kohen, they are the Kohen's money. That's not the same thing as a carbon. If you make something a carbon, whether you give it to temple funds, even if you dedicate it as a sacrifice for me, this animal will be a shlabim, but in some sense, the sanctity of the carbon removes it to some extent from my own domain. So it belongs to a different domain. So davar hanader is not just I took a neder, but the neder was effective in moving it to a different world, a different domain. So if I say the book is like a carbon, that works. But the book is like truma, that doesn't work, because at the end of the day, even though there was an act of neder, but fundamentally, what was accomplished is simply it now belongs to the priest. It's his. So that's one of the distinctions that is drawn. But the question is a good question. Let me stop here for a minute. If there are any questions about what we've seen so far, please speak up. Otherwise, we'll look at chapter 3. We'll start with chapter 3. As many mishnayot as we can do in chapter 3. They're all
so
yes.
far, no questions in chat. But
okay.
Please feel like if you're in the participants, I'm happy to unmute you. Or rather, if you're in the attendee column, I can unmute you.
Okay, so we will continue.
I just have one
Yes.
observation. It seems
Yes.
that in Ktubot, the language had to be very specific. And here, it's the opposite. Like, it's not the same standard.
Right. So you've touched on what is one of the core issues in this tractate, in the Mishnah and Gemara. I'll mention the principle now, and we'll deal with it later. Several chapters deal with this issue, actually, and they're very technical. We're not going to spend. I'm trying to get in the few times we're meeting to the real basics of the tractate. But what you've raised is a very, very central question about Nedarim. The Gemara has a statement, and this is presumed to be a fundamental principle, that when somebody makes a statement about I forbid X to myself, and we're not exactly sure how to define X. There are dozens of cases in the Mishnah where the Mishnah raises the question, what does X mean? Okay? And the principle, which is a very important principle for the Talmud, is this, that X may mean one thing in certain halachic domains. But when it comes to a neder, we have the following principle. Don't forget this principle. It's central to the whole tractate. In Nedarim, halech acharei l'shon b'nei adam. When it comes to a neder, we follow the way people use language. We don't look necessarily at a dictionary definition, and we don't even look, says the Mishnah seems to say, the way the word is defined inside the Bible. That's not what rules. What rules, according to the Mishnah and the Gemara, picks this up is Lashon B'nei Adam. How do people use the language? So what the tractate Nedarim is dealing with, and we saw this even last week, language is a central feature of the entire tractate. What is the language? What is slang? What is half statements from which we can infer full statements, etc.? To what degree can a person come and say afterwards, I didn't mean that. I meant something else. This comes up in the Mishnah, actually. So maybe we'll have a chance to look at a couple of Mishnah that deal with that. But the principle that touches on what you're saying, and it's very central to the whole tractate, is what I said. Halech acharei lashon b'nei adam. We follow the way people use language, not dictionary, not what the Bible says. And this could vary from one community to the next. In one community, certain words mean this, and in a different community, the very same word carries with it a different significance. And the bottom line is that we determine it based on how people use it. There is a Mishnah that I was thinking of doing this Mishnah, not now. Maybe we'll go back to it, which is the following: suppose somebody makes a statement, and we're not sure the statement can be understood one way or understood a different way. So the Mishnah says, and it's actually, I'll tell you, since you raised the question, it's so important. Just look at chapter 2, Mishnah 4. Just chapter 2, Mishnah 4 has a very interesting principle. Chapter 2, Mishnah 4. 5 words. Stam Nedarim lahachmir upeirushem lahakel. Stam Nedarim lahachmir, that's it. Those 5. What does it mean? So what it means is this. If somebody makes a statement, and we don't know what the person is thinking when that person made the statement, use certain language, he or she, whatever, use certain language, and we don't know what it means. It could be this, it could be not. It could be a language which works for Neder. It could be a language which doesn't work for Neder. It could be a language which only forbids me with 2 things, and it could be a language which forbids me with 200 things. And we don't know. Says the Mishnah, if we don't know, then we go l'chumrah. Then we take the more stringent view. If we don't know, and we know a way to find out, someone took a neder, whatever it is, for whatever reason we can't find out, we go with the stringent view. So 200 things are forbidden with one definition of the language, the other one only 2. So 200 are forbidden. However, upeirusham lahakel. That means if the person comes afterwards and says, I didn't mean that, I meant something else, then we believe the person has the right to come afterwards and say, when I said X, I didn't mean X to govern all these things. I meant a particular thing. So normally speaking, within range, of course, of something which is, on the scale of normal, I would say, or possible, not something crazy and far out, then according to the Mishnah, we then follow what the person, we take the person's word, and only those things that the person says that they had in mind, only those things are forbidden. But the language obviously is very central to the whole tractate from beginning to end. So that's a very important point, and thank you for that question. Okay, now we still have plenty of time, so let us now begin with. Let's start with chapter 3 of the Mishnah. Very important Mishnah. Let me explain. The Mishnah says, Arba Nedarim itiru chachamim. There are 4 kinds of vows that the sages rendered permissible. And what does it mean they rendered them permissible? So let me explain. There is a concept that comes up later in the tractate. Actually, it's a very unusual concept. We may take it for granted, but don't, because it actually is quite amazing. And that is, if you took a vow, took a neder or a shvua, let's stick with the vows. This book is forbidden to me to read for 30 days or whatever. And then I say, something, I made this book forbidden to me, but this book is my study guide for a major test that I'm taking in a month, whether I can be accepted to some school or some program or some job. And how did I realize that? I never would have made such a neder. So then you can go to a court, the Beit Din, and the Beit Din, you tell the Beit Din, and the Beit Din says, since you didn't realize it at the time, we are matir your neder. The neder is no, the neder is not valid, and we uproot the neder from the very outset. That's called hatarat nedarim. Hatarat nedarim. That's the subject of a chapter later on in this tractate. But this Mishnah says something different. As Arba Nedarim Hitiru Chacham means there are 4 kinds of vows that you don't even have to go to the court, that they are permissible by in and of themselves. They qualify as Nedarim that you don't even have to go to the court to do Hatarat Nedarim. They're ipso facto permissible. 4 kinds of Nedarim. And the Mishnah says what they are. And we'll explain each one. Nidre Zeruzin, Nidre Havai, Nidre Shagagot, and Nidre Anasim. For these 4 types of vows, says the Mishnah, they are in and of themselves, they're not binding. You don't have to go to the court, they're not binding. And now the Mishnah will explain what these 4 kinds of Nedarim are. So let's start with the first one. Some of these are not intuitively obvious, I would say, but let's start with the first one. Nidre Zeruzin. What does it mean, Nidre Zeruzin? To be Zariz means what? To be, what's the right word? How we translate the word Zariz? And they translate here Zariz. A Zariz is someone who acts quickly, who is very, what's the right word?
Hasty?
Aggressive.
Alacritous.
Alacritous is a good word. Alacritous, yes. Acts quickly, acts decisively. But over here, what it means is Ketzad. The Mishnah says, what did Nidre Zeruzin? Hayamocher, very strange. Hayamocher Chayfetz v'Omar. Kodim she'eni poches lecha min. What's the next word over there? Min asela. V'alo omer kodam she'eni mosif lecha ala shekel. Shneim rotzin b'shlosha dinarim. It's like this. Nidre Zeruzim, the case the Mishnah gives. Now the question is always how much we can expand these cases to other settings. But this is a typical case. You go to a shuk someplace to buy something, and the buyer and the seller, what's called handling, they're going to negotiate with each other. You go to the market. There's the shuk in Israel, or at least the old Arab shuk, and maybe even some of the Israeli shuks as well. Oh, I see that scarf. I like that scarf. How much is it? That's 100 shekel. 100 shekel. He says, and the guy says, if I sell to you less than 100 shekel, this food will be forbidden to me. And I say, 100 shekel. If I pay more than 80 shekel, more than 20 shekel, this food's forbidden to me. The other guy says, okay, if I sell it to you for less than 75 shekel, I say, if I buy it for less than 40 shekel, so each of us is forbidding things on ourselves under these conditions. But at the end of the day, we reach an agreement, 53 shekel. The Mishnah says that those statements, if X, then this object becomes a carbon, kodam, forbidden to me, that's not valid. Because everybody understands, says the Mishnah, that in these situations, no one really means to take a neder. It's part of the game. You are negotiating in these settings. I mean, normally you walk into a department store or something, you can't start negotiating the price. You know what I mean? You go in, there's a price, and we don't have that. You go into Whole Food, whatever, Trader Joe, whatever. That's the price. You're not gonna start negotiating with the checkout person how much I pay. But that is 25 cents. But they would have 17 cents last week. That doesn't work for us. But in these settings, this is a given. This is called Nidre Zeruzah, where 2 people enter into this negotiation of sorts, and everybody knows that the initial statement of each of them is not real. If I sell for less than 100, this food's forbidden to me. Everybody knows he doesn't mean that. So under those circumstances, when each side is actually negotiating, according to the Mishnah, those statements to forbid something upon myself, you don't even have to go to a court to annul the vow. That vow has no standing whatsoever. That's called Nidre Zeruzin. Again, what other settings might this apply to? That way the Gemara discusses. Is it only business in the shuk, or might it apply to other situations as well? That's a Gemara question. That's called Nidre Zeruzin. Okay. Now let's try the second one. The second one is, let's see. The second one is, what's that? Before the second one. Before we get to the second Mishnah, there's something else here. The Mishnah, we go to this towards the end of the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer. This very Mishnah. This is actually very interesting. Omer. I want you to eat in my house. And you made the following statement. Omer, kol neder shani atid lidor hu batel, ubilvad she'yehei zachur b'shat haneder. What does this mean? Person makes a condition. A person says that. In other words, I want you to come to supper to my house, right? And I say to you, if you don't come to eat in my house tonight, I forbid you to benefit from anything that I have. Okay? So that is according to the Mishnah. That's also Nidre Zeruzim. It's not just this is picks up on the first day. It's not just two people negotiating in the market, but clearly, I want you to come to my house, so I'm making this statement. I don't really mean to forbid you on everything that I have. On the contrary, I want you to come eat with me. You're my friend. I want to develop more of a friendship. That Mishnah says is Nidre Zeruzim. But the Mishnah has a statement at the end of this Mishnah, which is the following. Omer, kol neder shani otid lidor hu batel, uvad she'ezachur b'shat haneder. Person says, right? Person says the following. The Gemara says this Mishnah is sort of, the language is actually cryptic and has to be filled out more to make sense. But the Gemara understands the Mishnah to be saying the following. A person can get up in the beginning of the year and say, all the vows that I plan to take in the course of next year, this coming year, I say right now that all of those vows are not binding on me. So according to the Mishnah, you can do this. However, with one condition, provided that at the time you take the vow, you remember the condition. Now, the Gemara discusses this, and actually what emerges from the Gemara is quite the opposite. That if you remember the vow, if you remember the condition you made, then actually the vow does take effect, because you're saying, I don't care about the condition that I made. I'm dissolving that condition. I'm overriding that condition. But if you don't remember, if I stand up in the beginning of the year and I say, I'm making the statement, all vows that I take in the coming year are null and void. So if I don't remember when I take a vow, it's null and void, because the first statement is binding. I didn't override it. Whereas if I remember when I took the vow, so then the vow is binding. Now, why is this actually a very interesting rule? This is something actually that we should be familiar with from a different setting. What does this sound like? Sound familiar?
Kol
Nidre. Kol Nidre. This is the huge dispute about Kol Nidre. Now, what is Kol Nidre? Kol Nidre, I would say, is probably the service that more Jews go to than any other service, even more than the Eilah. Kol Nidre, Jews who only go one day a year to the synagogue, they show up for Kol Nidre, typically. But what is Kol Nidre? We're all familiar with Kol Nidre and the nusach, the tune for Kol Nidre, the solemn tune. It's very powerful. It reduces Yom Kippur. But what are you doing in Kol Nidre? So there's a huge dispute about Kol Nidre. According to most commentators, this Mishnah is cited. When they talk about Kol Nidre, they cite this Mishnah. According to most commentators, what Kol Nidre is essentially Hatarat Nedarim. It's basically Hatarat Nedarim. So Kol Nidre is Hatarat Nedarim, and what you're saying is all the court, this kind of court convenes, and the court says that all the vows that people took during the past year, all those vows, we are annulling those vows. They're all null and void. The vows, the oaths, Haramim, the Shavua, the Nedarim, Kinuyim. The vows they took with a kinui, with an incomplete language, all of that. That, according to most of the classical authorities, is what Kol Nidre is. It's what's called Hatarat Nedarim. That's most of them. Against them is Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam, who's Rabbeinu Tam? Because Rabbeinu Tam is very, very important medieval commentary, maybe one of the most important, Rashi's grandson. One of the chief was called Balei HaTosfot, and he argued that Kol Nidre is not that at all. Kol Nidre is not that I am annulling the vows of the previous year. What Kol Nidre is, he says, is I'm making a statement in the beginning of the year. Because Yom Kippur is towards the beginning of Rosh Hashanah is the first, right? Rosh Hashanah. So Yom Kippur is 10 days later. I'm making a statement that the vows that I will take in this coming year, I'm saying right now that those vows are null and void. And then it will be subject to what the Mishnah says. When I took the vow, did I remember that I made this condition or not? So according to Rabbeinu Tam and his group, Kol Nidre, I'm saying the vows that I will take, the Nedarim, the oaths, all that, I'm saying right now that those vows have no standing. I take a vow 3 months from now? No, null and void. And that would work provided that when you made the vow, you forgot about the condition. Because if you remember the condition, then you don't care about the condition. You're saying I'm overriding the condition. Now, these two different views of Kol Nidre actually find expression in the text of Kol Nidre. Because if you remember Kol Nidre, there are different texts. One text of Kol Nidre, which is sort of a mishmash, is you remember Kol Nidre, Tiyanan, etc. B'Yom Kippurim zeh, ad Yom Kippurim haba aleinu l'tova. If you say B'Yom Kippurim zeh, right? You know the nusach, right? Yom Kippurim zeh, ad Yom Kippurim. So then you're saying from this Yom Kippur till next Yom Kippur. If that's your language, that's Rabbeinu Tam. You're saying that I am making a statement now about the Nedarim that I may make during the coming year. Yom Kippurim zeh until next Yom Kippur. Yom Kippurim haba aleinu l'tova. But if you notice in many of the Machzorim, they have a different text. In many of the Machzorim, it says, Yom Kippurim she'avar ad Yom Kippurim zeh, from last Yom Kippur till this Yom Kippur, Yom Kippurim zeh ad Yom Kippurim haba aleinu l'tova. That's very common in many of the new Machzorim, and you're saying both. You're covering your bases. You're saying both. We are annulling the vows that we made in the previous year. That's a standard Hatarat Nedarim. And I'm making an additional statement that any vows that I may take during the coming year, those will also be annulled. That is not called a neder. I'm not matir the neder because I haven't taken a neder yet. There's a different term for that, and the term for that is called a moda'ah. Mem vav daled ayin aleph. A modia. I'm making an announcement. I'm saying publicly that those vows that we will take during the coming year will be null and void. So according to Rabbeinu Tam, Kol Nidre fundamentally is a moda'ah, and according to many of the others, it is Hatarat Nedarim. And one of the sources that's quoted over and over again is this Mishnah and the attendant Gemara that we're not studying regarding the Mishnah. Okay, that's an interesting thing to know. Okay, it's clear. So this is Kol Nidre, actually. we can't read the whole tractate. We can't go through Masechet Nedarim without talking about Kol Nidre. So this is Kol Nidre. This is Mishnah. This is chapter 3, Mishnah number 2. Mishnah number 1. I'm sorry. Okay. So the first case, but the case of the Mishnah was Kol Nidre Zeruzim. People were talking. Come to my house tonight, I can't make it. I want you to come. I've invited. Listen, if you don't come, I forbid all my property on you. Says Elizabeth Yaakov, the guy doesn't mean that. It's just a way of encouraging him to come. I really, really want you to come. But you don't need to go to a court to be matir that Nedarim. This is Nidrei Zeruzim. Okay. Whether the first opinion agrees is a question, but that's what Rabbi Elizabeth Yaakov says. Okay, we still have time. So let's continue with next Mishnah number 2. I'll stop here for a second. Does anybody have a comment or question? If not, we'll just continue. Okay. Now we have the second kind, the second time. Let's get to the second one.
Rabbi Silber, what are Nidrot, Nidrei Havai?
I'm going to read that right now.
Okay.
Nidrei Havai is the second type. And we'll spend just a couple of minutes on that. And next time we'll pick up with Nidrei Shkagos and Nidrei Anasim, because they're very central. Nidrei Havai, okay? The word Havai is like, what's the right word for Havai? It's, I would say purposeless in a sense, or exaggerated. We'll see the example. Nidrei Havai, okay? The Mishnah says, Nidrei Havai. What does it mean, Nidrei Havai? That these Nedarim take no effect at all. Amar, the person said, Kolim im lo ra'iti b'derech hazeh kayote Mitzrayim. Im lo ra'iti nachash kekoret beit Abad. Those are the two examples. Person says, Kodam. Kodam again is the language of a korban. This should be awesome to me. This table, this food, this whatever, these books are forbidden to me, right? If in fact I did not see on this road the number of people that left Egypt. In other words, I saw 600,000 people walking on the road here. And if I didn't see them, I forbid all of my food to eat for the next 6 months. Or if I didn't see a snake the size of a press, of an olive press, right? Those are statements that are exaggerated statements, and nobody believes that the person is actually saying. It's a way of exaggeration. It's a way. I saw a lot of people on the road. I swear, a lot of people, 600,000 on this road. So we say this is not this. The neder is not, has no effect. Now, by the way, this raises actually another very interesting question. We're talking in this tractate about Nedarim, okay? What about not a neder? What about if a person takes an oath, a shavua, not a neder? I say I am nishma. I take a shvua that that this table over here is that I saw a table the size of the Empire State Building. Or I say I swear that I saw a table, which is a table. What is the status of those oaths? I swear that a table is a table. Or I swear a table is not a table. Or I swear a table is the size of the Empire State Building. So if I took a neder along those lines, according to the Mishnah, I've said nothing. It's simply not a neder. I don't have to know the neder, because people understand it's nonsense. It's havai. It's not nonsense. That's true with a neder. When it comes to a shvua, we have something with a shvua that we don't have with a neder. And that is, we have a concept in shvua, not neder, what's called a shvuat shav. A shvuat shav is understood by the Mishnah in Shavuot as not a false oath, but an oath which either is obviously false, or obviously true. I swear on the table that it's a table. Wait, it's obviously a table. What do you swear? So that the oath adds nothing. It's an oath. It's a purposeless oath, but a purposeless oath is actually forbidden. It's forbidden from the Torah. It's called the Shvuat Shav. Shvuat Shav is understood by the Gemara in the second Shavuot to be a violation of the Torah. We don't have a comparable concept when it comes to a neder. We've never heard of a neder shav. We have heard of a shvuah shav. What is the difference between a neder shav and a shvuah shav? Why is the neder is not a problem, but a shvuah shav is a problem? And this touches on a very basic difference between a neder and a shvuah. We discussed last week very briefly the Mishnah's understanding and the Gemara's understanding, which is not the simple reading of the Chumash, but their understanding is that a shvuah is where I say, I am forbidden to do X. I swear I will not sleep. That's a binding shvuah. But if I say, I take an oath which forbids sleep upon me, that doesn't take effect. Because sleep is not something you can forbid on yourself. It's a bomamish. It's just a concept. It's not something you can feel and touch. That doesn't work. So in other words, a shvuah is I forbid myself. A neder is I forbid the object. And sometimes there are stringencies in the other direction as well. But that's the concept. But one of the basic differences between a neder and a shvuah is this. A shvuah is an oath that you take and you impose God's name. A shvuah is b'shem Hashem. Whether you actually need to always explicate God's name, or whether you don't always have to explicate the name of God, it's sort of assumed that the name of God is there. When I say shvuah, that's a question. But in effect, in one form or another, I'm nishma b'Hashem. I swear by God's name. And therefore, when I swear by God's name, if there's no purpose to me swearing, then I've used God's name in vain. And we're not permitted to take God's name in vain. So therefore, a shvuat shav is a serious infraction. When it comes to a neder, there is no name of God with a neder. I'm saying this object should be like a carbon. This object is forbidden to me with a neder. This object's forbidden with a carbon, or like whatever, an ola, chatos, whatever it is. So that works, but it doesn't work in these cases where it's havai. But the fact that I took a neder, a purposeless neder, okay, you took a purposeless neder. People shouldn't talk for no reason. But there's no prohibition because I haven't taken God's name in vain. Because neder doesn't have God's name. So that's an important distinction between a neder and a shvuah. So just summarize what we have. Next week, I didn't want to continue with this Mishnah because that's a very important idea of nidrei shkagot and nidrei onsin, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff in the Mishnah. But just to summarize what we have here, so we saw two of the things that I'll mention. Three things that we saw today. One is again the difference between a davar hanadur and a davar asur. When you take a neder, it works with a davar hanadur. I can say this should be like a carbon, because a carbon is something that is nadur. I created the carbon. Generally speaking, there might be an exception to that. One carbon where I don't create, but I can't get into that right now. Maybe we'll discuss that next week. But that's the idea. Whereas davar asur, forbidden food that's asur to me to eat, the veil, a treifa, that I didn't create the yisr. The Torah said it's asur. That doesn't work. You can't say this book should be like a pig, because that doesn't work. Because I didn't make the pig forbidden. The Torah did. It doesn't work. That's the distinction of davar hanadur, davar asur. Then we saw briefly the question the Mishnah says here about making a statement in the beginning at a certain time that the Nedarim that I take later will be annulled. Will that be valid? And I brought into that discussion the question of kol nidrei. What is kol nidrei? According to one view, that is exactly what kol nidrei is. According to a different view, kol nidrei is the nullification of the vows of the previous year. And there are different texts which suggest one or the other. And then we come to this question of certain Nedarim are not valid. You don't need to go to the court to invalidate a neder. It's called hatarat Nedarim, which we'll deal with in some ways. But some vows are ipso facto annulled without going to the court. And the Mishnah says there are four types of vows. The first two are nidrei zeruzim and nidrei havai. Those are the first two. Nidrei havai simply exaggerated or statements which are ridiculous statements. They have no effect. Nidrei zeruzim seems to be cases where we know the person doesn't really mean it, either because there are two parties negotiating, And according to one view of the Mishnah, Elazar ben Yaakov, even in situations where it's obvious, I want you to come eat with me, and I say, if you don't come, all my food's forbidden forever. So Elazar ben Yaakov says that's an obvious case. The person doesn't really mean that. So you don't have to go to the court to annul it. What remains for us to, and I talked about Shvuat Shav versus Neder Shav. There is no Neder Shav. There is a Shvuat Shav. Next week we'll continue with the other two categories that are very important: Nidre Shagagot and Nidre Onsim. And we'll talk about Shgaga and Ones and do other mishnayot as well. If anybody has any questions, you can always email me at dsilber@drisha.org. Thank you all for participating. Looking forward to continuing the study of Nedarim.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. And just a quick note, next week, Sunday morning, the US will be switching over to summertime. If you are joining from outside the US, this class will be at -4 Zulu time as opposed to -5 Zulu time. So for example, if you are joining us from Israel, then this class will be meeting at 7 as opposed to 8. And with that, I hope to see you all next week. Take care.
Thank you.